Welcome to the Line Movement MMA Betting Show. I'm Daniel Levy from Best Five Picks and Half the Battle, joined now by Dan Tom of MMA Junkie and the Protect Your Neck podcast. Today, we're going to dive into the rematch between Deiveson Figueiredo and Joseph Benavidez because they're about to fight for the vacant flyweight title this Saturday night at Fight Island, Yas Island, Abu Dhabi. Dan, you saw what happened the first time, but as you know, the rematch is always different. How you doing today?
I'm ready for this rematch, man. I'm getting hit by the proverbial waves being caused by this island. I think it's the third set of waves if we're going by surfer analogies this weekend, this Saturday, of course, headlined by a rematch that I'm excited to talk to you about.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, there's a lot to consider now when you're breaking down these fights. I mean, the judges are looking for certain things in Abu Dhabi. The fighters are performing a certain way. So much to discuss. And just real quick, want to give a big shout out to all our followers, all our supporters, everyone that checked out the first ever episode last week. We truly appreciate all your support. Everybody at linemovement.com, our producer, Jordan, everybody behind the scenes, we truly appreciate it. All our supporters, thank you so much. Go to linemovement.com or at line_movement on Twitter. And Dan, let's get right down to business because the main event of the evening, the rematch between Joseph Benavidez and Deiveson Figueiredo for the vacant flyweight title. They tried to do it once before, but Deiveson Figueiredo missed weight, and then he knocked out Joseph Benavidez in the second round. There's narratives about headbutts. There's narratives about coronavirus, about missing weight. I mean, we could go on forever, but the bottom line is, as of right now, where we sit here today, they're going to rematch on Saturday night, Dan.
And that's how I'm treating it. And knock on wood, the UFC has seemed to have done everything they can, putting all the protocols in place and even pulling all the strings in Figueiredo's case to get him over there. And so far, it's going as planned. So let's treat it as so, my friend.
Absolutely. So the first time they fought, I mean, there's a lot to talk about. I think the biggest talking point for me and something that's kind of hard for me to wrap my head around is that all three judges scored the first round for Joseph Benavidez. And you know what, man? I disagree. And I want to know how you scored it here in a second, but let's talk about it. When you talk about a fight, I mean, I would say there's three main phases of a fight. There's stand-up, there's wrestling, and there's jiu-jitsu. And when you look at these three, I would say Deiveson landed the harder shots. As far as the wrestling, only one man landed a takedown. That was Deiveson Figueiredo. As far as the jiu-jitsu, only one man got a near sub. You saw that arm bar. It wasn't just like, oh, he rolled for a little arm bar and, Joseph, shrugged it off. No big deal. No, this was a deep arm bar attempt. He had to do the hitchhiker escape to get out. Otherwise, his arm would have been broken on national television. So I feel like Deiveson showed he's got the goods to compete in all realms of the fight, but yet all three judges scored the first round for Benavidez. So, I mean, that kind of makes me think, is it just a case that, that's what the judges were looking at in Norfolk, Virginia, or am I missing something here in Joseph Benavidez's performance that allowed all three judges to unanimously give him that first round?
I agree as far as scoring it for Deiveson, but I don't think that, scoring it for Benavidez is outlandish. And I always say that people will cringe, but they have to remember, Dan, and I know you understand this, but for our audience and for the masses, whether you're like this or not, I think we can all understand that this sport, we don't always agree with the judges. In fact, most of us from media, hardcore fans, and pundits are more on the same side of each other and more consistent overall than sadly what the sample size of the judges provide. That being said, it's almost kind of forced us to have two scorecards in our head, right, Dan? It's who we think is winning, which is the guy with the harder shots, who's doing the more damage, who's being the more effective fighter, whether we're grading their grappling or their striking. And that in line, though written broadly, goes with the rules. However, there's this almost second criteria that the judges have made us kind of do a song and dance to. And even that has changed. In the mid to late aughts, it was the late round takedown. We saw Team Jackson come to the rise with that. Judges have gotten a little smarter. You can't BS them as easy per se. That being said, volume and output is still something that BSs them. Whether I'm a volume and output guy, by the way, but whether you agree with it or not, the judges weigh heavily on that. I'm also not a big stats guy, Dan, but Joseph Benavidez threw double the amount, landed nearly double the amount, and still only was, I believe, 3% landing at 48% to Figueiredo, which was accurate at 51, especially for the shots that Figueiredo throws. But to your point, and I guess my point being that we both scored it for Figueiredo, if you watch in between rounds, uh, it's not Casey Halstead, but it's one of Benavidez' coaches. He says that was a good round for you, and Benavidez almost like double takes him, like what? And the guy reads it and goes, "No, no, no, you did good." And Benavidez is kind of like, "Okay." And I like that, Dan. I like that because it shows that Benavidez, he had the wherewithal to know that he can't rest on his laurels on a close round, even if all three of the judges scored. It doesn't matter what me or you think, Dan. All three of the judges scored it for him, but he didn't rest on those laurels. And I'm not saying Benavidez is going to win or you should root for him, but if you are a Benavidez supporter, one thing you have to like is that he had the wherewithal to know not to rest on winning that round. And even after getting hit with said shots, almost getting caught with the armbar, Benavidez comes out like a true pro. He's not shaken up. He gets right back on the clock. That's something you like to see as a coach or as a bettor.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, Joseph Benavidez is in the position he's in for a reason. This is a legend of the WEC, the UFC. He fought for the first ever UFC flyweight title. He had the first ever UFC flyweight knockout. So, I mean, you can't say enough good things about him. It's just that I feel like almost as a betting man, you almost have to change your approach in a way, because it's like when I watch that fight and I think about the psychology between the two fighters, I feel like, do you remember that Conor McGregor quote where he said, the featherweights hit like flyweights, so it's nice down there, you know? And I feel like Deiveson Figueiredo, when he was fighting Joseph Benavidez, he thought that every single thing Benavidez threw at him was a joke. He's like, oh, that's all you got? I'm going to keep walking you down. Why don't you throw 5 shots at me? Because my one shot that's coming back is going to damage you. So it's really interesting. If this fight hits the scorecards, I don't know what to expect, Dan Tom.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Especially when Abu Dhabi, and I do want to say, without hashing it out, and obviously we don't have the results in front of us. The judges, maybe not the refs, but the judges did I want to say did a better job for certain things. But yeah, overall the trends to me have kind of been all over the place. I wouldn't know what to expect either. And let's just say that even if I do end up picking Benavidez here again, even though he's got a better number from the betting perspective that you just were talking about, Dan, it doesn't feel like the same confidence. It doesn't feel like the same fight. It doesn't feel like the same approach. And like what you mentioned on last week's show, Dan, rematches are often different.
I mean, Dan Tom, you already know how I feel about rematches. I tend to favor the person that won the first time, and I didn't think the first fight was relatively close. It's just that, I hate to beat a dead horse, but when you talk about the judges these days, I feel like that's a new element that we really have to account for. Because before, it would just be about the value, about the matchup, and all this stuff. And yeah, that's really, really important. But now I feel like we gotta decide, what do the judges look for? What do they favor? Because it's like, I favor what Deiveson Figueiredo was doing, but they favored what Joseph Benavidez was doing. So that's where I kind of gotta draw the line, because it's like, yeah, based off my history of picking rematches, based off the history in itself of rematches, I mean, you know that the person that won the first time wins the second time 65 to 70% of the time. So it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, I'm leaning Deiveson Figueiredo. I might even bet Deiveson Figueiredo. But if I would sit here and look you in the eyes with a straight face and tell you that I'm not worried about the judges, that'd be a complete lie.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you my hand here. This is the first place I'm going to be saying it, just like last week. That's a good thing. I'll be honest, when I don't have my takes in order or 100%, which perhaps we'll get to on this card, but for this fight, yeah, I can confidently give you my pick. But can I say that I'm confident in my pick? No. That being said, I think it's going to make for some good talking points here, Dan, that we've already unfolded, and I'm actually taking Benavidez. And even though I still wouldn't be surprised to see his body work and pace pay dividends down the stretch in the form of perhaps a stoppage opportunity. I mean, Figueiredo was shaking his shots off. It's very discouraging from, being a Benavidez supporter to, perhaps looking at an inside the distance line. But I do like him down the stretch, regardless, especially on the scorecards. And not just because, not banking on we're going to get those same judges, because again, there's no crowd here. So maybe with that crowd going, they weren't able to hear the clearly much harder shots from Figueiredo in this relatively empty arena. Those hard shots from Figueiredo are going to count for a lot more. They will make the scorecards a lot sketchier. Back to your point, Dan, as no matter who you think is winning, it could be all over the place when it gets to the scorecards, but I think it could get there because here's the two perspectives. One, which I think is the more obvious, the more safest, and probably going to be the right one, which is yours, Dan, as far as, taking the younger guy, the guy who won the first one, the guy who, regardless of the controversy, which there was, and we can talk about here in a second, regardless of that, before that, again, we're on the same page, Dan. I think Figueiredo was having the edge. I would have scored that first round for him. But, however, and I read my breakdown, I said that none of us should be surprised the first time I'm around if Figueiredo, a right hand, especially if Joseph Benavidez is floating to that power side, if he catches him and stops him, none of us should be surprised, right? And sure, that's what happened. But before the controversial headbutt, which I would say is more Benavidez's fault, by the way, for whatever that's worth, but before the controversial headbutt, Figueiredo, the reason why he won the rounds on your card, Dan, or mine, is because he already landed flush shots while Joseph Benavidez was in position and while he was shifting and very vulnerable out of position. That one in particular looked to stun him toward the end of the round, about a minute left in the first. The point is, you could take the perspective that even though supporters like me were thinking that if Benavidez can survive the shots, he wins, even though he ended up getting stopped with the headbutt attached, you could also make the argument that the previous 5 to 7 really hard punches that he landed before that, Benavidez was undeterred. Was it enough to win the round in our eyes? And I think it should have won Figueiredo the round. Sure. But you can also take the perspective of he was able to take Figueiredo's power prior to the headbutt. And if Benavidez, in theory, can still take the power, and again, that's something else I highlighted in my breakdowns, is that Benavidez gets hit earlier. He tends to get hit less as the fight goes on. He doesn't just get better, he gets hit less. So if, again, he can take those shots early and not cause himself a headbutt, which it benefited him when he faced Alex Perez, but it backfired against him last time. So there's a lot of headbutt bad luck. Hopefully that juju is out of the way. We get a clean winner regardless, Dan. But I guess what I'm saying here is my theory for why I'm picking Benavidez, and I'm not confident. I don't even think I'm going to bet him, by the way. I'm definitely not telling you, but from an analyst perspective, I feel like if he could survive those shots, he's going to be banking rounds down the stretch with body work, especially to a Figueiredo who's coming in about 10 pounds lighter. And does that backfire? He may make the weight more easily this time, but cutting too early, does that make you weaker to the body? That is something we've been seeing lately. Sorry for the long-winded rant, but that's my thinking.
Well, I think there's a big if in what you just said. You said if he can take the shots, and it's like that's a big if, because it's like Pantoja couldn't take the shots. John Moraga couldn't take the shots. Joseph Benavidez couldn't take the shots the first time. Now, when we talk about what if he can take the shots, I mean, does that mean what if he doesn't get knocked out? Because I still feel like even if he doesn't get knocked out, he's still going to feel the impact of these blows. I mean, back in the day, we used to talk about the two hardest hitters at flyweight were always John Moraga and Ryan Benoit. But now I don't think there's any debate that the hardest hitter at flyweight is Deiveson Dice Duguera Figueiredo. So it's one of those things where, like we were talking about at the beginning of the breakdown, Joseph Benavidez shots weren't impacting Deiveson whatsoever. He was literally walking him down like, oh, this is a young schoolboy that I'm beating up. But whenever, and I guess here's where we disagree, because I feel like prior to the fight ending blow that Joseph was impacted, not just by the shots, but for example, when Joseph went to shoot for a takedown, you saw how easily Deiveson sprawled. You saw how easily he turned that into a submission attempt of his own. So it seemed like to me that he was kind of big brothering him a little bit. Now down the stretch, that's where it gets interesting, because it's like, yes, the volume of Benavidez will pile up. There's no doubt about that. But what I'm wondering is, will the damage also pile up? Will Joseph be walking a little bit slower because he got hit with some hard shots? Will he be discouraged at all? Will there be a knockdown up until that point? Will a bunch of his takedowns get stuffed? So those are the kind of questions I have. And back to the headbutt. So, you said it was Benavidez's fault because for whatever reason, he charges in head first. Look, same way I didn't make any excuses for Alex Perez when he got headbutted and knocked out in the first round. I'm not making any excuses for Joseph Benavidez when he allegedly, clashed into the heads and then got knocked out. Because, I mean, he didn't get knocked out with a headbutt. Look, if he got dropped with the headbutt and then Figueiredo followed up with some punches, then I'd be like, hey, this should be a no contest. But the headbutt happened to both men. Both men got impacted by the headbutt. And then a couple seconds later, then he lands the fight ending blow. So it's a legit knockout in my eyes, Dan Tom.
I mean, that's what it's going in the record book as. You can't argue it. And they're gonna go make it definitive this time around, which is why this is a case where I'm actually glad they're having a rematch as opposed to other rematches. I wasn't so much down for. And no, yeah, totally. I totally could see that fact, which makes it a little sketchier even picking Benavidez here because uh, Davison was able to take the headshot so well to the point where the only way I think a Benavidez headshot's going to affect him, and crazy because you forget Benavidez is one of the heaviest hitters too. Also, shouts to John Lineker, the other Brazilian who had trouble making weight, was one of the division's most heaviest hitters. So I totally agree with you there. I'm just more looking at the body and calf kicks. I figured that was going to be open. If you go into the corner, you could tell that was a part of their plan. They reminded those calf kicks are open all day. If he's able to land a really good one of those or to the body, and again, when you're cutting a lot of weight, it can make you weaker there. And as time goes on, but again, these are big ifs. I'm definitely not saying they are not. But as far as the submission attempt goes, that was super impressive because Davison Figueiredo, even though he's a jiu-jitsu guy, pardon my pronunciation, but he came up with a lot of grappling accolades and tournament experience through the Marajo brothers, Yuri and those gang over there. And usually he's more of a positional guy and a top guy. So showing that he can keep Joseph Benavidez honest with those arm bars was super impressive. However, when I look back at it, Joseph Benavidez had the proper defense. I trust him in scrambles like that all day, and I think those things are actually good because it'll make Figueiredo use more energy. However, you touched on something, and it was the most impressive thing from either guy in the fight, which was Figueiredo's takedown defense. And particularly, I believe it was the second shot because Benavidez was officially 0 for 2 in that fight. But you see him not just defend the shot and show really good hips, but Benavidez is smart. He uses even the failed shot like Khabib to push him to the fence. But you see Figueiredo get a step ahead of that. He frames across the hips, breaks Benavidez's grip, uses head position and steers him and turns Benavidez against the fence. Like that was such solid work. And as far as shutting down any type of scrambles, if Figueiredo can do that, he's going to give himself all the shots he needs. Because Figueiredo, I don't know about rounds 4 and 5, but I do believe he's going to be carrying that power till at least round 3. So it's definitely an uphill battle. I agree with Figueiredo being favored. He's definitely favored to win in my eyes. And perhaps it's a bit of bias here, Dan, but I do, me, I'm also very favorable to pace guys over athletes. Maybe it was Al Hassan scaring me again and reminding me of those matchups when they go wrong. And I have a little bit of that burnt into my head. But I'm going back to the well here and backing another high pace guy. I'm not saying it's the most confident pick. If that makes sense, I'm just making my case as to why I guess I ended up on this side.
So, I mean, we're going to talk about the weight cut and, the jet lag, which are two huge factors here in a sec. But before we do that, I want the analyst perspective. Talk to me about Davison Figueiredo's karate stance because he comes out there. I know you saw that stance. It's almost like he's playing with his opponent. It kind of reminds me of like back in the day. Do you remember that fight between Anderson Silva and Damian Maia when so everyone only remembers the last 2 rounds where Anderson started coasting, but the first 3 rounds was actually phenomenal. Anderson was coming out in a bunch of different stances, trying a bunch of different things. Cause I know Damian said something in the pre-fight about how he's the spider, therefore he's got 8 limbs. So it's going to be easier to submit him. And like over in Brazil, you don't say some shit like that about a fellow Brazilian. So, Anderson was like, I'm going to absolutely embarrass this guy to a point where he never wants to fight me ever again. So Anderson's going out there. He's doing the drunken master. He's doing all kinds of things. But one of the stances Anderson did in that fight kind of reminds me of Davison Figueiredo's almost karate-like stance. What do you kind of think about that?
Funny because we watched him, and I know you were amongst the same, Dan. You're one of the most consistent grinders out there. You watched tape on this guy before he got to the UFC, that is Figueiredo. And in a lot of his regional fights, you see a little bit of that flair, but it was more kung fu than karate back then because he almost had just like a wildness to it, would just throw spins and back fists. Like, dude, this guy doesn't, give an F, right? Then he tightens his style up a bit when he gets to the UFC, but you're right. He still does this, and this almost long framing karate guard. And in my opinion, it's not just for flash. I think he puts it out there, especially with his size and length. in the division, kind of like John Jones does. It makes you imposing, it makes you fill space, and it also creates that psychological urgency that you have to get past it and you have to do dangerous, risky things that are probably going to help the anxious filled movements to get past it. And those things will open you up for a classic Davis and Figueiredo counter in the form of uppercuts and right hands. So the guy's goofy, he's weird, but he's also very smart, man. He does it for a purpose, and the repercussions for second guessing him or making the wrong move around that guard is very, very devastating, obviously.
Some great points you bring up, man. So now we got to talk about the weight cut, the jet lag. So obviously, one of the big talking points with Davis and Figueiredo, not just this time, not just last time, but every time, is he's one of the bigger men at 125 pounds. So this guy cuts some serious weight. And people feel like if he doesn't get early finishes, that it can affect him down the stretch. I mean, even though I saw him go out there, win that third round against Pantoja, who I'm so high on Pantoja. I think that guy's a beast. And by the way, if Davison doesn't make weight, Pantoja is fighting for the title, just so you guys know. But here, I'm just wondering, so the jet lag, it's like one of those things where I feel like if you come like too soon, obviously you're going to be feeling that jet lag. If you come too late, then you can get acclimatized. But he came right in that middle ground. So I'm wondering if it's even going to affect him at all. Like, he's already right on the sleep schedule right when he got there. He's not going now to the beach or anything. He's basically in his room, quarantined, cutting the weight, and then we fight Saturday. So what do you think what kind of impact do you think the travel is going to have on Davison, Dice Duguera, Figueiredo?
I don't want to pile on to Davis and Figueiredo because whatever he's feeling, everybody else is having to deal with. However, Figueiredo has had to do it all in a closer, more compact time frame. That alone can give you stress and anxiety, plus having to wait and having that uncertainty of your fight going on with all these COVID tests. So even if he's handling all that, I actually went to his Instagram and his stories. And I don't think he's gonna make. I think he's gonna make the weight, which is good for Figueiredo supporters. The potential bad news, because I don't know this, folks, so I'm not presenting it as fact. But the potential bad news is that I'm more worried about the weight cut than the jet lag here, Dan. Basically, he looks really drawn out to me, and he looked really big going into the last fight week. He came into last fight week by his own admission at 145 pounds, folks. That means you have to cut 20 pounds in a week for a flyweight. The percentages there are insane and impossible. So no wonder he looked much bigger. Is he still going to be much bigger and have the strength advantage? Of course he is. I'm not saying that's going to change. However, you do got to wonder how much not only could it hurt him here, but how much did it help him in the past one as far as that durability? We've seen bad weight cuts from durability, or even if their durability holds up, their whole fortitude and foundation crumble, by that third or fourth round. So that's actually my more worry. I don't think the jet lag will be as big of a deal. I imagine, like many fighters, they've been preparing for this weird fight time. So that's my take in a nutshell.
So, and I mean, when you cut to flyweight, you're literally on the brink of your body fat. That's why it's notoriously one of the toughest cuts in the history of the sport. All right, now we got to get to the picks. So the line is -200 for Davison Figueiredo. The comeback on Benavidez is +170. Dan Tom, what's the analyst official pick?
Despite all the things that happened and all the things we picked apart, a lot of this fight still remains the same. If Figueiredo, in my opinion, has to at least hurt, if not finish Benavidez early. Otherwise, Benavidez has a bigger chance to run away with it. I'm still going to pick Benavidez in that dynamic. You know me, Dan. I like the pace guys. That being said, from a betting perspective, they're giving me a plus number for a guy I love, a guy I picked before, a guy I'm picking again. But I can look you straight into the camera and say I'm probably not even going to be touching this fight. I don't blame you if you're playing Davison Figueiredo. I definitely don't blame you if you're picking him. But my pick is Benavidez by decision.
I'll say this, you get a +170 and you're picking the guy outright, I would recommend betting it. But for me personally, Dan, I'm going to go, and I'd love to say and still, but unfortunately he missed weight the first time, so it's going to have to be and new. I'm going to go with Davison Dice Duguera to come out here and win the vacant flyweight title, man. I think he big brothers Benavidez once again, goes out there, proves why not only is he the best flyweight on planet Earth, but he represents the new generation of flyweights. And real quick, before we move on to the co-main event, just in case Davison doesn't make it to the fight for whatever reason, quick pick, who you got if Pantoja and Benavidez fight for the vacant belt?
I'm going to go with Benavidez as well. As much as I love Pantoja's back take, he can still be scrambled with. And MMA mass not always the thing, but I'll tell you what, the axe chopping guy from Tennessee, who Dustin Ortiz. I got a lot of respect for his sample size, so I'll leave it at that. And I got Benavidez for a decision again.
Talking about my boy, stay chopping.
Stay chopping. That's right.
For me, and I think this one will be a little bit closer, but I would actually go with Pantoja. I feel like Joseph doesn't perform his best in title fights. This has been the case since back in the WEC. You could even see going into the Figueiredo fight, he puts too much extra pressure on himself. Pantoja would have nothing to lose. He'd be the underdog, and I would take him in that spot. Co-main event of the evening. In the middleweight division, we got a showdown between Jack the Joker Hermanson and Kelvin Gastelum. And man, this is, talk about a crossroads fight, man, because both these guys need this bad. And this is one of those situations where, you know, I hate to say this about, you know, top 5 guys, top 10 guys, but to me, this is almost like an old school striker versus grappler matchup, man, because I feel like if Jack gets on top of Kelvin, I'm worried for Kelvin. If Jack boxes with Kelvin, I'm worried for Jack. So, I mean, do you at all view it like that? Or do you think one guy can have an edge everywhere the fight goes?
It depends, right? Because what version of Gastelum are we going to get? People point, and I don't blame them for it. You know, they'll look back to, you know, the Magny fight or the Weidman fight, guys who can kind of make it ugly, who know how to grapple, and whether they take it back or go for those front chokes or head and arm chokes like Weidman does, there's certainly places to abuse Gastelum, who will give his back. He will turtle. He'll look to do things like Granby rolls, but Kelvin's a blown up middleweight, man. It's not exactly Uriah Faber at featherweight or Benavidez, these guys that can afford to give their back and scramble. Very dangerous. This is a tough one, man. Full disclosure, I'm in the middle of doing tape study for this because I had to submit early staff picks for Junkie, and I actually picked Gastelum. But this show is called Line Movement. We're on Line Movement MMA right now, baby. And the line movement is definitely moving, and it's moving in the favor of Hermanson. I'm seeing minus 110 at the time of this recording on my screen. I'm not sure what kind of numbers you're seeing, Dan, but I don't blame what I'm trying to say. I don't blame support, pick, or money coming in on Jack Hermanson, especially if you were able to get that plus number. It's just, are we going to get that older version of Gastelum that I referenced, or it wasn't even 3 fights ago, although it feels like it was almost 3 years ago. Do we get the one against, you know, Jacare Souza, a guy who was shutting down takedowns and, you know, fighting a more disciplined fight for the most part? He had his scares in that fight and was able to handle himself accordingly for the most part. That being said, you know, what disciplined Gastelum do we have coming in? He's gotten his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, by the way, Dan, since we've seen him last, but he's also coming off of a knee surgery. And now we're going to ask a guy to wrestle and do things like grappling. For a guy that already likes to box, and knee surgeries will make you want to just kind of keep into the boxing range, you know, how confident is he going to be when it gets dirty with Jack Hermanson?
Tough fight to call, but the thing is, man, I'm not going to count out a 28-year-old, especially one like Kelvin, who he's known for. When you count out Kelvin Gastelum, that's when he performs his best. And, you know, when people start saying, oh, this guy's a fat middleweight, he should go down to 70, that's when he knocks guys out. And I feel like it's been the same thing his whole career. He's one of the most talented guys in the UFC, but, you know, I might like to light up a blunt, might like to eat some Hot Pockets. It happens from time to time. But the thing is, man, now he's coming off 2 losses. So there's no room for error here. There's zero margin for error. So I'm expecting the motivated Kelvin Gastelum, because you got to think about this, man. When you have this fight of the year war with the champion Israel Adesanya, and you know, allegedly it's 2-2 going into the 5th round. I mean, for me, I personally thought Adesanya won a little bit more convincingly than 2-2 going into the 5th. But everyone thinks it was 2-2 going into the 5th, so let's roll with that. So when you have this fight of the year with Israel Adesanya and you feel like, man, you're inches away from winning that title, I mean, you already know the deal, man. After you lose that title shot, the next fight, fighters aren't necessarily their most motivated. You already know the deal, man. It's always that letdown spot. And with Till moving up to 85s, you know, it's easy to underestimate a guy like Till, who was coming off those devastating losses. And you saw how big he is now at 85. It was just a bad matchup for Kelvin, and he had an off night. He was unmotivated coming off a title loss. Now with those 2 L's behind him, now I feel like he was like, okay, I got to get my shit together. And here with Jack Hermanson, it's a situation where Jack Hermanson is very profitable to bet on in specific matchups. Like if Jack Hermanson, if I know for a fact that Jack Hermanson is going to get on top of Kelvin and keep him there, I mean, I might not just bet Jack, I might max bet Jack because Jack has some of the best ground and pound in the entire sport. And obviously, you saw that boot sweep he hit on Dave Brand. You see his guillotine. I mean, he even attacked Jacare with that guillotine. The only issue here is that, and I would hate to, question the toughness of a top 5 guy like Jack Hermanson. That's not what I'm doing at all. But what I'm going to say is that Jack Hermanson is a very intelligent guy. And when you're a smart guy, you think a little bit too much. And when things don't go according to plan for a guy like Jack Hermanson, he starts to kind of question things a little bit. Whereas Kelvin Gastelum, I'm not saying he's dumb, but I'm saying more so that you're not going to ever see any quit in a guy like Kelvin Gastelum because he doesn't overthink things. He kind of just goes in there and fights. Whereas Jack, I'm sure his IQ is actually higher than Kelvin's. I'm sure if they both took the SAT right now, Jack would get a better score than Kelvin. But in fighting, it's a little bit different. Sometimes in fighting, I feel like, and I hate to use terms like the dumber guy, but sometimes the dumber guy is the tougher guy because he doesn't overthink things. And what I'm trying to get at here, Dan, is that if Jack Hermanson can't get on top of Kelvin Gastelum and finish him, I think Jack is in big, big trouble. Because if he tries to box with a guy like KG, I mean, you already know the deal. I mean, Jack's got some serviceable hands, but Kelvin's a guy who right before his fight with Darren Till, he had an 100% knockdown rate at middleweight. What that means is that he dropped every single opponent he fought at 185 pounds until he got in there with Till. And I haven't calculated the recent percentages, but I assume he's got what now, a 95% knockdown rate since he didn't drop Till in that fight. So he's dropped every single middleweight he's fought except Darren Till. So I really think that, maybe the first round, Jack comes out there, takes him down. The thing is, if somehow Kelvin can survive that, get back up to his feet, go to the second and third round, I feel like Kelvin might go out there and light Jack up, and Jack starts to get discouraged when the takedowns don't work. So that's kind of where I stand with this one. I mean, don't get me wrong. I totally feel like Jack could go out there, take him down. I mean, we saw Chris Weidman take him down. We saw Magny take him down. I mean, I know I'm bringing up shit from half a decade ago down a weight class, but it still happened. And, those are long body guys. So I know that's going to be Jack's game plan here. I know Jack wants to come out here with his body lock, put him on his back and smash him. And that could very well happen. It's just if that doesn't happen, I know if this becomes a battle of wills that Kelvin Gastelum's going to win.
I agree with a lot of the points you're talking about there. Unless Jack Hermanson is able to, he's been working his, I hate to say this, Dagestani handcuff position against the cage.
Yeah.
Even though Jack Hermanson is actually a good back taker and he can transition when he falls off backs, he can go then submit and take arms like he did Carlos Vemola, that beast back in the day. That being said, even the fights which we can talk about with that Magny fight that Gastelum lost, were these guys holding position? No. They had to, at best be a top class wrestler, giant fucking size advantage, pardon my French, with Weidman, and he still had to catch him in transition technically. So I guess in my opinion, I do side with you in the sense that not only does it probably have to be a submission or bust, that it's probably going to have to be catching him in transition or bust, because even though I completely co-sign with Jack Hermanson's ground and pound level, do you see him holding his back or holding him from mount and just being able to have the time of day? Or do you see Gastelum scrambling? Gastelum's going to scramble. That's what he did in that Magny fight, which, by the way, I don't know about you, but I scored it like a draw because it's one of the arguments we have where like we don't give 10-8s enough. Like Gastelum drops Magny twice in one round, takes him down twice, gets 2 to 3 passes, including one crucifix and ground and pound, takes the back once, and that's not even including the rest, whatever happened for the rest of the round. Yet the guy couldn't get a 10-8, which would have been a crucial one in round 4 if we do want to dig a fight up from half a decade ago. So the point is, did he even lose that fight, first of all? And we know Magny is longer than Hermanson. Magny is deceptively strong, can hold positions. And was he able to hold any positions on Gastelum, despite Gastelum giving his back and doing risky scrambles? No, he wasn't. So, as you're talking about this, Dan, I'm beginning to co-sign with you. And I know that me and you have both been a kind of a defender on Gastelum, because not so much that we defend him. I think we try our best to break down fights as they are, unbiasedly as possible. There's always a little bit of bias. That being said, Dan, do people have something against like Gastelum, maybe it's because of his physique or whatever. You kind of touched on it, but it always feels like people, whether it's the odds makers or the public, whether he's the favorite or the underdog, he's still seemingly not getting um, the credit he deserves. And obviously, again, he had those recent letdowns; those make sense. You explain those well. I'm just talking about overall. Is there something like a Kelvin Gastelum thing that people like poke at with this guy?
Yeah, there's always been. I mean, I remember when I bet him at plus 160 odds against Tim Kennedy, and people were acting like,
I
yo,
remember
why
that.
do you
Yeah,
even
that was a
bet
good
on
one.
fights, dude? Like, maybe you should retire. You know what I mean? Because I was like, maybe not. You know what I'm saying? So, and let's talk about that fight for a sec, because that fight could be the way this one plays out. The first round,
Sure.
Tim
Yeah.
Kennedy showing his size. First round, Tim Kennedy's got him pressed up against the fence and making him work. The thing is that if you gas yourself out trying to do that against a guy like KG, that's where you can come back. And just so people know, there's no bias here. I love Jack Hermanson. I max bet Jack Hermanson against Talis Latis. I bet Jack Hermanson against David Branch. I'm very high on Jack the Joker Hermanson. It's just that I know Jack better than he knows himself. And I know the fact that if Jack can't get this early ground and pound finish, if Jack can't get this guillotine choke, if Jack can't dominate with wrestling, Jack doesn't like to box with guys that hit harder and are faster than him. And that's what Kelvin Gastelum is. So that's what I'm worried about. If I was putting my money on Jack Hermanson, I'd be praying, Jack, please take him down right away, because for every single second that stays standing, I'm going to be sweating bullets. But on the flip side, if I'm betting Kelvin and Jack takes us down, then I'm like, oh shit, please get up, please survive, please work to gas this guy out. So I see why it's a dead pick 'em. Now, for me, the reason why, and it's one where I feel like you could make a solid case for either guy. You know what I'm saying? It's like, if you're going to make the case for Jack Hermanson, all we got to do is bring up the Weidman fight. We bring up the Magny fight. We bring up all these guys taking him down. If we want to make the argument for Kelvin, all we do is bring up all the times that Jack wasn't able to get his takedown, like his last fight against Cannonier, like the Maheda fight, even the Cesar Mutanchi fight. So it's one of those situations where you can make a strong case for either guy. But big Vegas casinos weren't built with everyone being on the same side, and it appears to me like everyone is on Jack Hermanson. So I'm a slightly lean with Gastelum in this one.
You know what? And before we close up this segment on this fight, I'll say this one thing with Hermanson. And again, you guys know me. I'm not picking on fighters. If anything, I appreciate the fighters that are brave enough to express their vulnerability of from social anxieties to performance anxieties, which are very real when you're fighting on the biggest stage. We all know Jack Hermanson has had to deal with that, and unfortunately, we've seen it in his performances. He will kind of implode, especially with overwhelming athletic forces. That being said, part of me does think I think that this environment actually benefits people like that, like the Roses of the world, Rose Namajunas of the world, the Jack Hermansons of the world, because the media obligations are so much less. Even though the travel and testing is a pain, and then you don't have all the bright lights as far as the audience and all this crazy stuff going on. You get to go out there and kind of have your sparring matches. And as we've seen, Dan, from Justin Gaethje to Tony Ferguson onward, we've seen some somewhat impressive performances on a technical level, fighters fighting above their perceived technical ceilings in this pandemic era when they're supposed to be not getting their full training. You know what I'm saying? So part of me does kind of temper on banking on Jack Hermanson to implode. That being said, there's more than enough from a statistical or stylistic perspective to pick Gastelum. And even though I'm probably going to end up sticking with my pick the more I think about it, Dan, I may have to play this if I start seeing the money keep coming in and we end up seeing a plus money on Gastelum. I mean, what do you do then, Dan?
Yeah, exactly. And look, I'll say this to your point. I mean, you're 100% right. He's a thinker, just like Rose. And we saw what happened in that third round with Andrade. And I'll tell you this right now, if there were two more rounds, I think you and I know what would have happened. But regardless of that point, Dan, I don't care if there is one person there or 100,000 people there. If Jack Hermanson can't get Kelvin Gastelum to the ground, he is going to lose this fight, period.
That's a fair statement. That's a fair. So I guess we're on the same side of this one. We're on opposite in the main event, but the co-main event, I think we're on the same side here, Dan.
Yeah, and again, look, it's a pick 'em fight, so I see the case for both. I think we made the
Yeah.
case for both. It's just which way do you personally lean? I think we both lean Gastelum, but no disrespect to either guy, because I'm actually a big fan of both. I think they're great guys. And the thing is, I wanted Jack to get that Weidman fight because for selfish reasons, so I could go out there and max bet Jack in that spot. But regardless of that, I mean, I thought that'd be a great win. This is a tougher fight for him, so let's see how he performs on Saturday night. I can't wait. And man, in the featured bout in the lightweight division, we got Mark Jacasey taking on Rafael Fiziev. And man, this is one hell of a matchup because Mark Jacasey, you know, he's one of these guys. I still consider him a prospect. Look, he's just a kid. He's only 26 years old. And it's one of those situations where, you know, he got rushed a little bit. He had a couple highlight reel wins when he was like 22, 23 years old. They pushed him up to a level he wasn't quite ready for, and people kind of wrote him off. But now he's building himself back up. And I feel like now he's got that proper experience to where he can go on that run that people wanted him to do initially, Dan.
Agree, man. He had to learn the lessons the hard way, as often prospects do. You know, whether you're coming from a region that needs its stars like the UK, which, by the way, UK getting a lot of shine this weekend. Most of their fighters doing well on Fight Island. But then he also, you know, migrated over to American Top Team in that killer pit, you know, in the UFC. So everywhere and every angle, this guy was in the thick of it. He had to learn some tough lessons, but I love this progression. I love where he's at. And let's just say I don't hate him as this favorite.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And I'll tell you something about this kid Fiziev because he's impressed me a lot. You know, when I think about guys with less than 10 pro fights, there's some of the targets I want to bet against because at the UFC level, there's no seasoning or experience. I mean, it's get down to business right away. And this kid, you know, for only being what, 7-1, 6-1, whatever his record is, he's going out there and he's performing at the highest level right now. That's why they put him in a fight with a guy like Mark Jacasey. It's just that now we're really going to find out if he's ready to swim with the Sharks. Because look, beating Alex White is cool and all, and he looked fantastic in that fight. But if your game isn't quite up to par, basically what I'm trying to say is that you're not going to get a couple cupcakes to build up that seasoning and experience, which I just referred to. You got to be ready to go right here, right now, Saturday night, Dan Tom.
It's going to be a big question to answer. You know, we love salivating over these higher level Muay Thai strikers because we've been, at least for most of us, been wanting to see more and more of them since, you know, the mid-aughts of the UFC days, right? Now we're seeing them trickle in. You've got this guy who's got a little bit of the rub from the Shevchenko team. I picked him every time so far, which granted is only twice, but one of those times in the fight that he lost against Magomed Mustafayev, who's got that no country for old men Anton Chigurh haircut there. He unfortunately ate a spinning kick. But when you look at him, he does a lot of the things that I love. He can fight from that southpaw stance as well, go to the body, go to the legs, things that I completely stand for, Dan. But you got to knock out or out decision a guy who hasn't been knocked out and has been to decision a lot at the highest levels in the UFC. So I think it's a really big ask for Fiziev here. I haven't gone back to look at his last fight with Alex White since I saw it last, and or Diakasey's more recent fights, but I just know I've been really impressed with Diakasey. He seems to be putting it together. And I will say this, Dan, if Diakasey goes back to some of his older habits of going to the clinch and muscling guys down to secure those rounds late in the third, definitely wouldn't hurt him in this fight.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, I remember every single time I'd break down a Mark Jacasey fight, and this is prior to when he went on that losing streak, I was already impressed with his maturity because you remember one of those fights where it was 1-1 heading into the third round, and he knew he had to make a decision. He goes out there, takes his opponent down, grinds out the round, and he's this guy that's known for, you know, the spectacular knockouts, but he's shown smarts in there too. So I like that about him. And here in this spot, I mean, I know his last few fights, he's been getting off on those calf kicks, very, very effective weapon. It's just, do you really want to go in there and stand and bang with a guy like Fiziev, give him that one chance he has to go out there and win? So I'm curious to see how quickly Mark Jacasey tries to get it into that clinch situation, try to mix in some takedowns.
Me too. I'm so curious in this fight. In fact, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised for our line movement audience out there if you've liked my gaming sheets, my betting sheets the day of. This is a fight that I don't know if it's going to be on there, but I'm let's just say I'm researching it right now. But I have a lot of interest from a fan perspective and possible opportunities. We'll see what I come up with, but you know, I'd be lying, and if that's something that I don't do, especially to this audience here, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't interested.
And for everybody listening at home, just let us know who you got. Tell us in the comments below. Hit us up at line_movement, linemovement.com. And man, let's get down to a pick because look, right now they got Mark Jacasey -155. The comeback on Rafael Fiziev is +135. I know Fiziev, however you want to pronounce it, we know exactly who we're talking about. My boy Armand. He's been impressing a lot of people with the serious striking caliber he's got, his skill set, even mixed in some takedowns too. Who are you going with in this matchup?
You know, as much as I want to fall into the technical analyst honey trap, Dan, as analysts, we tend to like people like Loma Lukbung Mi and things like that. But similar to like Loma, as technical and as much as we want to get excited and she deserves credit, there's something about, like you said, having a certain small sample size, being rushed to the big stage against fighters who have been there, against much less bigger fighters who are going to not just have a bigger sample size of experience, but bigger wells of tools to pull from and bigger in fight 3 round relevant UFC experience. So my pick's going to be Diakese. I don't have too much trouble telling you that despite not researching it. And I'm liking the point of entries from either side, but I like Diakese, of course, is the side I'll probably be on.
Look, I understand if people take the shot on Fiziev, you can make references to the calf kicks, which, by the way, ever since Diakese's losses, he ended up employing those as weapons. So to me, that's a sign of someone that learned from their mistakes. So I get the case for Fiziev, but personally, I'm going to go with the guy that I consider to be more well-rounded and more experienced, and the guy that truly paid his dues inside the UFC octagon, and that's Mark Diakese. So I'm going to agree with you on that one. Now, flyweight division. I know we talked about Pantoja already, but now we got to talk about him again because he's taking on Askar Askarov. And man, this is a hell of a matchup right here. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you the odds before we speak any further because they got Pantoja minus 210. The comeback on Askar Askarov is plus 175. Now, I personally, pre-tape kind of think that the line might be a bit wide, even though I would favor a guy like Pantoja, even though I think Pantoja might be better everywhere. I feel like Askarov's kind of flown under the radar. I mean, his fight with Moreno was a banger. The next one with Tim Elliott, I felt like he clearly won. And honestly, I felt like Tim Elliott's recovery and amazing cardio robbed Askarov of getting a first-round knockout. I know you know what I'm talking about, Dan.
I think Tim Elliott would argue with you. I mean, you could tell him that elephants flew into the ring and he would have believed it because Tim Elliott still doesn't know what happened in that fight from the shots that he took from Askarov, to your point, right?
Yeah, no doubt about it. So, I mean, where do you see both these guys kind of approaching this? Because I feel like Askar Askarov is a guy where I've learned a lot about him in his UFC fights. Because on the regional scene, I thought he was one of these guys that likes to play off his back, likes to go for low percentage subs. But then in the UFC, he's out here, and that's not really the case, man. I mean, he's pretty damn well rounded. He's aggressive. He will go forward the entire time. And Askarov's no slouch, but sometimes it's not enough to just be no slouch against someone like Alexandre Pantoja.
Absolutely. I do think that you could make the case that it is a little wide because, again, this is a flyweight fight. Something I often preach that my audience is familiar with. I'll compare female fights and flyweight fights to heavyweight fights, Dan. They're the complete opposite of eye value, complete opposite of finishing percentages, complete opposite as far as knockout. Why would I be tying them together? Because despite whatever value you want to put on a heavyweight fight, the tides can turn just that easily. We talk about judging, Dan. You said it off the top of the show. When we're looking at our bets, whether it's for Fight Island or otherwise, you always have to look at where your sport's at as far as judging trends. You can't predict it ever, but you got to be aware and try to factor it in as best you can. And judges, as much as we, they don't, pick up counters or technical striking. Well, they're really bad at grading technical grappling. They're really bad at grading submission catchers. We talked about that with Figueiredo Benavidez. It's something I always get really upset about, right? With that being said, in females and flyweights, if they don't produce a lot of finishes and they're just getting into exchanges and scrambles, now we're having to depend on the judges knowing what the hell they're watching. And I don't know about you, Dan, it's never comfortable depending that the judges know what the hell they're watching. So for that reason, I always compare female and flyweight fights with wide lines to heavyweight fights in that sense. Be careful. It can split on a dime like that. That being said, I do like Pantoja here. And I want to ask you about this, Dan, because the reason why I do also agree that it could be closer despite really liking Pantoja is because even though I think that Pantoja can scramble and is the better grappler, and I also think he's the better striker. I know I just picked and played Tim Elliott, which I don't know if I'll ever play him again. The point is, even though I picked Elliott, I'm not going to be crazy and be like, oh, Elliott's some great striker with a great chin. Or none of those things are true, right? So I would be careful putting that weight as far as Askarov striking just from seeing it in the Elliott fight. I don't know if that tells us a whole lot, folks. But I will say this, Pantoja's been fighting it out with some of the best since like Chuto Brazil days for a decade or even over a decade now. and he's so young looking and composed, and he's such a badass, Dan. I think we forget the damage that he takes and has been taking. So that does kind of worry me. I do think that Pantoja, he is a flyweight where the bottom could fall out. As much as I love him, he's a flyweight where I think the bottom could fall out in that reason. So for that reason, I think this line could be a little closer, but I got Pantoja here.
Look, I think down the line, you're right. I mean, this guy's had an over 10-year career. You already know the deal with that. But I feel like right now he's so close to a title shot. I mean, if Davison misses weight, Saturday night is Pantoja's title shot. So he's literally
Yeah.
right there. A win over Askarov gets him right in line. And when I kind of think about the two guys that beat Pantoja in the UFC, you think about the Dustin Ortiz fight, which was literally just a matter of seconds, which was just, one of those things where one guy had a little more back control than the other guy. You can make a case for either guy winning that fight. But the Davison Figueiredo fight, that's the one where it's like, if you can go out there and bruise this guy up and be the harder hitter, which doesn't often happen, Dan, but the case when you're fighting Davison, right? And the crazy thing about that fight is that you got to see the zombie come out of Pantoja, because he's getting cracked with these shots that knocked out John Moraga, that knocked out Benavidez, that knocked out all these guys. And Pantoja's just walking forward the entire time. Almost had Davison Figueiredo being like, what's it going to take to knock this guy out, man? Like, this is ridiculous. Like, can you go down already, please? So it's one of those things where I don't think Askarov has that kind of power. So I think if Askarov's to win this fight, he's got to get back to that grappling. And easier said than done. And you're not going to go out there and submit a guy like Pantoja. So you kind of got to hold him and stall him out. And Askarov doesn't really seem to me like that kind of guy. So I do favor Pantoja in this spot for sure. Now, Dan, let's talk about this lightweight fight here between Joseph Duffy and Joelle Alvarez. And it's interesting because for those that don't know, Joseph Duffy has a finish over Conor McGregor on his record. He also had the fun war with Dustin Poirier in the UFC. So, I mean, this is a very experienced guy. I mean, he's been in there with McGregor, been in there with Poirier, been in there with Vic. He's been in there with a lot of guys. And with Joelle Alvarez, I mean, you look at that record, 16-2. I mean, one does not simply get a 16-2 record in the lightweight division, but that's what he brings to the table. But the thing here is that, in his regional footage, it was kind of like a work in progress. It kind of reminds me of like a Spaniard lightweight Chito Vera. Like when Chito Vera first came into the UFC, and I'm not talking about top 15 Chito Vera that we see today. I'm talking about when Chito first came into the UFC, and you just saw how raw and how green he was, but you saw little glimpses here and there. Like the process was kind of off, but you'd see like a flying knee or, a flying back take, and you'd be like, okay, if this kid can kind of get a little more development, a little seasoning, he might be something one day. And I feel the same way about Joelle Albers. I feel like right now he's kind of raw. He's kind of green. I mean, the takedown defense isn't quite there. He kind of relies on his jiu-jitsu from his back, but he's got a couple things going for him that I really like. Firstly, he's massive for the weight class, 6'3". He's got a long reach, and he's tough as nails. And he's one of these guys that prides himself on his hard work, which is also another thing that reminds me of Marlon Chito Vera, So it's really a thing where in this year off, has he leveled up enough to come out here and beat a guy like Joseph Duffy? Because we know what Joseph Duffy brings to the table. I mean, he's well-rounded as hell. He can box, he can kick, he can take you down, he can submit guys. I mean, he's done the whole bit. I mean, this guy is well-rounded. He's experienced. He's seasoned. One could argue he's on his way out. He's maybe one or two fights away from retirement. So I would actually say that Joelle Alvarez is the hungrier guy here. But technically speaking, will this year off be enough time to level up to beat a guy like Joe Duffy, Dan?
It's tough, man. My initial impression is almost what the line is. I don't think the line should be that wide. Perhaps we'll talk about that in a second. But that's my initial impression. I'm also, I'm a bit biased. I'm a Joe Duffy fan. He's a great guy in person. Easy to look at the resume and just, I feel like this is a clear-cut case we have in front of us, Your Honor. However, you mentioned a great point, and you used a great example in Chito Vera, Dan. And because, even just this week, we've seen lesser prospects, perhaps in lesser divisions, or maybe not lesser divisions. That's not fair, but other divisions, and we've seen them. But they're what's the common thread? They're around that same age range as Joelle Alvarez, and we saw them make big skill jumps that regardless of what side you were, no one really was predicting. plus the pandemic era where fighters can come out and have really good performances. It's real dangerous to know what we're getting from either of these guys, because like you said with Joe Duffy, he's also getting toward the advanced. He's already in that advanced stage of his career. I mean, you talked about beating Conor McGregor. After he submitted Conor McGregor, Dan, you have to wait about 3 more years till Joelle Alvarez even has his first MMA fight. I mean, you know what I'm saying? I mean, these guys are at complete different sides, but how far apart are they? Are we going to start seeing, more degradations? We've only seen Joe Duffy once since 2017, once in the last 3 years. He got crippled with calf kicks early by, Mark Diakase, was able to still get across to the finish line. But I mean, where does it go? However, Alvarez, how far is he going to fight from his type, Dan? At the end of the day, I believe he's got 14 subs compared to 2 TKOs, but he did get one of those TKOs recently and in the UFC. Granted, Daniel Bellardo, who I don't even think's won a UFC fight, neither here nor there. The fact is, the dog is learning new tricks, and we should leave some room to be surprised here. That being said, I don't think he submits Joe Duffy. Joe Duffy's only been submitted once by Ivan Masardo, which was like a decade ago. And if you look at the type of submissions that Alvarez gets as far as triangle chokes, those are Joe Duffy's special. Of course, he was a Japanese jiu-jitsu black belt, I believe, before going into more traditional Brazilian jiu-jitsu. I think he's going to be okay on that end. However, Alvarez has a lot of guillotines, so if he comes up and Joe Duffy's sleeping and he's a longer guy, kind of like James Vick was, and he's able to sting Joe Duffy, I mean, can he get a guillotine there after he rocks Joe Duffy? I mean, I guess I couldn't be that surprised if like that scenario played out. That being said, I'm going to pick Joe Duffy, but I'm curious to look into this one to see if this line should be as wide as it is.
Like I was saying about Joelle Alvarez's regional footage, I mean, watching it is almost as, effective as watching Chito Vera's regional footage. It'll show you flashes that he can finish fights, but it just shows like, man, he was so undeveloped at that time. You don't know where he's getting his training at. You don't know the kinds of guys he's fighting out there. I mean, it's just a different world over there in Spain. But the thing is that now that we've seen him in the UFC twice, and granted, when I bring up that 16-2 record, I know some will say, oh, it's a padded 16-2, and you might be right. I'm not going to, dispute that. But the fact that, he's got 18 pro fights under his belt, and now, he's getting a little bit of that experience before he steps up in competition. I think that's important to get that kind of ring time before you move up. And with a guy like Joseph Duffy, I'm not really sure where his head's at these days, because when you look at his wins, and not to discredit any of his wins, because I mean, I feel like, yeah, even though he fought like Mitch Clark and Reza Madadi and all these guys, he handled them accordingly. I mean, he went out there, blew these guys out the water. So there's no debating his wins. It's just one of those things where, he hasn't won a fight since 2017. The Vic fight was vicious. Then he comes back a couple years later. The Diakase fight was vicious. Now he's coming back a couple years later. And Dan, as you know, these things don't get better. They only get worse. So from a technical perspective, yeah, I mean, Joseph Duffy's the better fighter. It's just we don't know where his mindset's at. We don't know how much he wants this. We don't know. Look, he might come out here, start putting on a clinic, but let's say he gets cracked one time really, really hard. Is that going to deter him? Is he just going to keep going forward like nothing happened? That's where I got the questions, because this guy, Joel Alvarez, he's one of these guys that he's got nothing to lose. On the feet, he's so long and he's so confident in his jiu-jitsu that he'll literally go right at you, and he doesn't care if you take him down because he's that confident in his jiu-jitsu. He feels like he can go out there and submit you. He can go out there and sweep you. So he's going to let it go on the feet is what I like about him. And with this year off, he might have been able to level up a little bit. I know he's the hungrier guy here. So for me, it's a tough one to call. And I do favor Joe Duffy because I think he's the better fighter all around. But the mental stuff is where I have the issue, because I feel like if this kid, Joel Albers, just levels up just a little bit, he could be a problem to deal with, just that size. And, if he can kind of start working on stuff and takedowns a little bit, that'll really help his game out a lot too. So, man, at these odds, and I could be way off, but I would actually maybe take a small shot on Joel at like plus 305. Right now they got him minus 365 Duffy, plus 305 Joel Alvarez, just because I can't lay minus 3 something on Joe Duffy in his current form. And when I say current form, I'm referring to 2 years ago when I felt like he was on his way out. Now, 2 years later, I don't expect him to look any better. And I expect Joelle to at least level up a little bit. The question is how much. That's what I need to know. And I don't know. But when you get a number like this might be a spot where I'm willing to roll the dice. So I'm actually going to go out on a limb here and take the underdog, Joelle Alvarez. I could be dead wrong, but we'll see what happens Saturday night, Dan.
You know, I may come up on the same way after I finally research and dig deeper into this fight, Dan. But I just looked at Joelle Alvarez's Instagram. Looks like the dude's training in fantastic shape. Speaking of leveling up, we haven't seen this guy over a year. And even just in January, he got promoted to brown belt. So he's putting work in. And yeah, man, as far as betting goes, even if I end up picking Duffy, the betting perspective, you got to be looking on the other side of Duffy.
And I'll say this, in his UFC debut, you know, for a guy that people look down on a guy like Joelle Alvarez, right? Well, for a guy that people look down on, he goes in there against Damir Ismagulov, who, by the way, I consider to be a top 15 guy right now. Like in terms of talent and skill, I think Damir Ismagulov can hang with anyone in the top 15. And yeah, even though I clearly scored at 30-27 Damir Ismagulov, the fact that Joelle went 3 hard rounds with a guy like that in his debut, that's got to be a good learning experience. That's kind of like a benchmark where it's like, okay, this is what I got to work on. This is where I need to improve. This is what the high level of the UFC looks like. So now I know going forward what I need to address. Now, will it be enough? That's a completely different question, Dan Tom. But at least I know he's been in there with a legit guy, gone the 15-minute distance, came back, won his next fight inside the distance. Now he's got a year to get even better. So we'll see how it goes down on Saturday night, Dan.
Yeah, no, great points there. Really looking forward to this one even more now after talking about it.
So, man, the bantamweight clash that I am so pumped up for. I know you remember I was talking about my top flyweight prospect, Raulian Paiva. Well, now I'm going to talk about my top bantamweight prospect, Montel Quick Jackson, because he's taking on the very tough Welshman, Brett Johns. And man, this is just such a hell of a matchup. And, you know, I tweeted this out earlier. I said, let me tell you exactly what I said. I'm going to pull it up. I said, you know what fight Montel Jackson versus Brett Johns reminds me of? And, you know, I wanted to see what everyone had to say, but I didn't respond yet. But I'm going to tell y'all right here, right now on the Line Movement MMA betting show. This fight reminds me of a prospect clash between Jonathan Dwight Jones and Ryan Bader back when they fought on the Anderson Silva versus Vitor Belfort card. I don't know if you remember, but John Jones and Ryan Bader, this was the prospect showdown. This was the fight where, hey, the winner is going to move in the title contention. The loser is going to go to the back of the line, and these are two of the top prospects in that division. I mean, a little bit of a difference is both guys were undefeated. It's a different weight class, but so what? I see the similarities here because I look at Montel Jackson like a John Jones type talent. I look at Brett Johns like a Ryan Bader type talent, and I see this kind of being the bantamweight version of that fight. And you know, the line seems a bit wide to a lot of people, and I get why, because Brett Johns is someone you absolutely must respect. Brett Johns is an animal. Brett Johns went out there and got a calf slicer against a former Bellator champion in the UFC. You know what I mean? This guy is no slouch at all. It's just that when you talk about freak athletes, when you talk about once in a lifetime type fighters, and I could be way off here, but when I look at this guy, Montel Jackson, I don't often say that fighters remind me of the great John Jones. I don't often say that, hey, this guy could really be someone that, you know, carries that division to a new level and really represents the future, the next generation of the sport. But that's how I view Montel Jackson. I really feel like he could be the guy. I'm so blown away by what he brings to the table. Obviously, the skill set's amazing, but the physical qualities, because everyone's got a high skill set in the top 15 at bantamweight, the top 20, the top 25. But to differentiate yourself, and he's got these God-given abilities and all that stuff. But I'm saying the physical traits are like nothing I've ever seen. Because look, this UFC debut, he goes out there against Ricky Simon, who, I mean, you know how good Ricky Simon is, right? And this is on 6-day notice off the couch. So, I mean, he's eating a couple Cheetos, you know, eating some Tostitos. They give him the call, hey, you don't just have to fight Ashkan Mokhtarian, you have to fight Ricky Simon in your UFC debut. You know what I mean? So he goes in there against Ricky, and Dan, he gets put in the worst possible spot you can be in an MMA fight. That's face down ass up. You're fully back mounted. Guy's about to go out there, pound you out. It's about to be a referee TKO stoppage. And you know what Montel Jackson does? His arms are so damn long that he literally traps Ricky Simone's wrists when the guy's on top of him in back mount, and he takes no damage whatsoever. That was the first time where I was like, yo, no one else can do that. Like, that's some shit that no one's ever done before, ever in the history of the sport. So right there, and I mean, I was already impressed with his regional footage leading up to that, but that fight right there, I was like, man, this kid's ceiling is super, super high, because when you get in a position like that, Dan, that's when fights end. You you back mount a guy, they're fully flattened out, pound them out, the fight's going to be over shortly after. Not Montel Jackson. He didn't even take any punches. He didn't take any damage. And that's on 6-day notice against a serious wrestler. So right then and there, I was like, okay, let's see what happens next. Goes in there against Kelleher, and Kelleher's a tough guy. Look, Kelleher might not win every fight, but Kelleher is going to go out there and fight you. I mean, I know you remember John Lineker, who many people universally consider to be the hardest hitter in the bantamweight division. It's not like John Lineker knocked him out in the first 30 seconds. They had to have a war before John Lineker knocked him out in the third round. Well, Montel Jackson goes out there, hits him with an elbow, taps him out with a darce, no problem. Let's move on our way. You know what I mean? Andre Sukumtut, a guy who, look, he might not have a winning record, but one thing about Andre Sukumtut is he is known for his durability. Andre Sukumtut can take a shot, man. And, you know, Andre Sukumtut won a round against Sean O'Malley. Like, Andre Sukumtut knocked out Luke Sanders. Andre Sukumtut goes in there against Montel Jackson, and Montel was out there just owning him in every phase of the game, the stand-up, the clinch, the wrestling, the jiu-jitsu. It's like, man, this is an MMA clinic. And then the last fight against Felipe Colares, who is a black belt, by the way, you see 11 takedowns by Montel Jackson. You see him lighting him up in a way where the guy's head's bouncing back. And I know you remember those combinations he was getting off on Felipe Colares. And I'm gonna talk about that in a second, because one thing about Brett Johns, we'll talk about all the positives in a sec, but one thing about Brett Johns, the thing I don't like is that sometimes when the gas tank runs down a little bit, he'll get into this mode where he shells up and he starts eating a bunch of unnecessary shots. Kwan Ho Kwok was able to get him in that spot. Aljamain Sterling was able to get him in that spot. I am telling you right here, right now, Dan Tom, that if Montel Jackson starts teeing off on Brett Johns, when Brett Johns starts doing that shell, he might go out there and knock him out. Now, the thing we got to talk about is the grappling exchanges, because obviously we know that Brett Johns, he's not going to stand and bang with Montel Jackson. The reach is too long. This guy's output is too much. He's going to want to try to, you know, get this into a grappling fest. And man, I feel like trying to grapple with a guy like Montel Jackson. Look, if he's taking it on 6 days notice, he's not in quite, you know, the shape he needs to be. Okay, that's one thing. And even then, it's very hard to do. But here, where he's fully prepared, man, it sounds like a nightmare matchup to me for Brett Johns. And I love Brett Johns. I cashed on Brett Johns against Gravely. You know what I mean? But this one sounds like a tough one. I mean, can you make the case for Brett Johns for me?
Yeah, I'm excited to dive into this one, because this is the kind of fight where I typically, maybe it's my contrarian nature, Dan, I will, regardless if I pick or play, we'll go into the analysis almost trying to make a case for the other guy, because it's so hard to deny whether we're talking about the physical attributes or the skill ceiling of a guy like Montel Quick Jackson. Obviously, I'm right there with you on that. However, I also like Johns, and again, admitting my kind of betting or, you know, player bias, fighter bias, if you will, Dan. I love those pace guys, those submission guys, those grinders, especially if they've got that attitude intangible, right? That attitude intangible that kind of makes you stand out, that attitude intangible that makes you a performer on game day, that attitude intangible to where if you're getting beat dead to rights by Pedro Munoz and you're getting rocked and you're getting hurt, there's no chance of you to win the fight on the cards. You're still pushing forward and trying to win. I love seeing that, whether just from grading a fighter to betting on a fighter. So in those instances, yeah, man, you put a plus number. I'm going to go and look and observe the pathways. But my initial lean, I mean, I only see really two ways that Brett Johns wins this fight. One is that you get some type of scenario kind of mentioned, and I don't think it's an excuse. I think it's legit. If you look at the timeline and whatnot, I don't think it's Montel making an excuse for that Ricky Simone fight. And Ricky Simone, Vato, is no joke, man. I mean, so no shame there. But unless another scenario like that happens, Dan, where something bad weight cut, travel, something went wrong that we don't know about, and that starts to reveal itself after the first round, and Brett Johns can pick up speed, perhaps he can win a decision that way. But there's a lot of ifs. There's a lot of things that have to happen. And I don't mean to discredit Brett Johns' chances, mind you. The other way, which is very dangerous, and I believe Joe Soto off the top of my head had to learn this the hard way, is that opportunistic submissions, not just typical like because John's, even though he's got judo and wrestling, he's not your typical I got to get to the clinch, I'm gonna Uchimata sweep you, or I'm gonna double leg you from the clinch, work some position, pass, do some shoulder pressure, persuade you to the back. No, he'll drop back and go for unorthodox stuff. Now, it'd be hard to muscle any of the limbs from Montel Jackson because, again, you want to talk about, he's got some, I believe, Dan, you're good with these stats. I think he's got like light heavyweight metrics at bantamweight when we're talking about his reach and the size of his actual fist and glove size.
Yeah, Dan.
It's gonna.
I know you've heard this 100 times, but he's got bigger hands than Francis Ngannou.
Jeez, I can't compute that, dude. I cannot compute that. But yeah, so I mean, he's gonna have to like get some kind of hell of an opportunistic like leg lock type submission to have a chance. Otherwise, if this ends by TKO or if this ends by decision, or even if it ends by submission, anything inside the distance, that portion of the pie, if we had a percentage pie, Dan, most of that pie is going to say Montel Jackson. That's my early lean. I still want to go forward and look and research this matchup further. But yeah, it could very well be a tough night for Brett Johns. And I'm a big fan of Brett Johns, man. I love that guy.
I love Brett Johns too. I mean, for the reasons you said, he's tough as nails. He'll go there the entire time. He's going to try to win. I like the guy. I bet him against Tony Gravely for a reason. You know what I mean? The guy's an absolute dog. It's just back to the original example I made about Ryan Bader and John Jones. Ryan Bader's a hell of a fighter too. Ryan Bader is amazing. Ryan Bader's well-rounded. He's just physically outmatched and outgunned in every area by John Jones, kind of like Brett Johns is here by Montel Jackson. So I just have a hard time seeing Brett Johns out hustle Montel Jackson. And it's like, we talk about the gas tank and, maybe taking over. You saw that last fight against Kolaris where he unloads a 50 punch combination on him, which would gas out anybody else. I mean, you're out there trying to finish the guy and then he's perfectly fine in the second and third. So to me, I don't see him fading and Johns taking over. I see it kind of being a tough night for Brett Johns, who I respect a lot. This is just a really bad matchup in my opinion. Could be wrong, but that's kind of where I stand.
I agree with you.
So the betting odds, let's look at them real quick. It's minus 190 for Montel. The comeback on Brett Johns is plus 165. And actually it opened closer. So Vegas thinks it might be a close fight. They opened at minus 160 for Montel. I was actually thinking they might have opened it a little wider. So they think Brett Johns is a live dog here, and he might very well be. I could be completely wrong. Maybe Montel is not the next John Jones. Maybe that comparison is completely off. It's just from what I've seen, I don't see too many bantamweights with these physical tools that are so well-rounded in addition to that. Because it's one thing, some guys they got, the physical talent or the physical tools, but they don't have the skill set or vice versa. I feel like Montel's got it all. So that's why I'm so high on the kid.
Well, that point of entry is definitely tempting. We talked about those similar range of point of entries on earlier matchups on this card, Dan. And yeah, if that ends up being a bad matchup in hindsight, that could either be a really good line opportunity for really is not too much of a crazy too much of a crazy statement that you're putting out there that Montel Jackson is in fact a prospect on the rise. That's not a crazy statement there.
Let's get to this last one, man, because last but not least, in the lightweight division, we got Armand Sarukian taking on Davi Hamish. And man, real quick, looking at the odds, they got Armand Sarukian a minus 200 favorite and Davi Hamish is plus 170. This is a really good fight, man, because obviously Armand Sarukian has been making waves. Only 2 fights deep into his UFC career. And, like I said on my Prospect Watch article at linemovement.com, I said, one doesn't simply make their UFC debut against Islam Makhachev. And that's exactly what this kid Armand Sarukian did. And, no one would have held it against him if, he got taken down and submitted in the first round, or if he got dominated all 3 rounds. We would have been like, hey, you had to fight the top 15 Russian in your debut. It's all good, kid. Take a step back on your next one. Get back on the horse. But that's not what happened, Dan Tom. He goes out there, gets a fight of the night. Everyone's talking more about Sarukian than they are about Islam Makhachev, and everyone wants to see his next move. So he goes out there, and against Olivier Aubin-Mercier, I mean, to me, he dominated him. He won 14 minutes of that fight. He got caught with one little knee, gets caught with a knee, then immediately he's on a double leg. So to me, he won 14 minutes of that fight. Gritty win over Aubin Mercier, who's a 12-fight UFC veteran, who's a tough finalist, and this and that. Look, in your second second UFC fight, that's pretty damn impressive. But now he's got the Tasmanian Devil, Davi Hamish. We're talking about a former ADCC multiple-time jiu-jitsu champion. For those that don't know, when I talk about ADCC, I'm talking about Abu Dhabi. I mean, this is a guy in Davi Hamish has been to Abu Dhabi and, won that was it gold medal in jiu-jitsu? I think it might have been. Well, he's champion, so yeah, that's gold medal. Look, he's won gold medals in Abu Dhabi before. He actually, interestingly enough, they got a common opponent in Islam Makhachev, and Davi fought him in Abu Dhabi. So as far as acclimatizing and stuff like that, Davi Hamish is used to this Abu Dhabi weather and all those things, and Davi Hamish throws some bombs on the feet, man. And you start to take a guy like that down. You know how world-class the jiu-jitsu is. You let him get on top of you, the fight might be over shortly after. It's just that Arman Tsarukyan's a tank, man. So as far as the stylistic matchup, how do you see this one kind of playing out?
Stylistically, I really like Saryukian on here. I mean, obviously, you saw, I loved your prospect piece there over at linemovement.com. Looking forward to seeing more of those, Dan. And I was completely on board with the Armand pick. Y'all know I was high on him. I picked Islam Makhachev, but I remember breaking down that fight, warning everybody, if you assume that this minus 300 line that Islam Makhachev gets, despite it being deserved, even though he deserved to be that big of a favorite, that didn't mean the fight was going to play out that way. And that's, I think, something people have trouble deciphering, right? When we're talking about the analyst or the betting perspective. And that one, the betting perspective didn't match up with the analyst perspective, because even though he was the deserved favorite, we saw that Saryukian is no joke. I'm a really big fan of his wrestling and scrambling style. I believe he'd have to make a really big or stupid mistake to be able to give us a submission to Hamos in this fight, and that he can dictate. I also like his pacing. He goes after it, I believe he split at like 5 TKOs and 5 submissions. And the guy's even got head kick KO KOs on his record. So he's got the power, he's got the technique in all of his limbs. That's all good to go. But here's what kind of worries me. You mentioned it, Dan. Ramos already fought in Abu Dhabi. He has prior experience in Abu Dhabi. And a quiet trend going into this week I was looking at was people making their returns. I know, you ended up swaying me off for good reason as I got into the analysis. I actually ended up siding with Salikov. We had a really good discussion on last week's show, right? And regardless of how you score that fight, which I actually scored it the other way, regardless, the point was everybody who's fought there before. Jojua, we saw her this Wednesday. She fought
Lerone Murphy.
Was going to win. Lerone Murphy. Everyone who's fought there before, I believe, they're in the 90 to 100 percentile as far as turnaround wins, Dan. So that's something that actually really scares me in the spot for a guy who's a supporter. And let's just say, maybe we wouldn't be surprised to see Saryukian at some sort of angle on this week's sheet. I'm really interested, but that fact right there scares me, Dan.
Wow, I didn't even think about that. My boy Dan Tom bringing some stats to the table here. Hey, real quick, because I caught on something you were saying. So you were impressed with Arman Tsarukyan even before he fought Islam Makhachev?
Yes. I know the sample size was sketchy, and we can talk about that for sure. It's kind of good that the guy was fighting all over the place, from like Road FC to, not just regional Europe or Russian shows. I know it's a sketchy sample size, but it's like one of those things. And again, from the analyst and betting perspective, that I don't live and die, nor should you live and die by. However, there is a certain point where we can look at someone's record. And I did this for a recent bet, and it worked out for me. And you can, oh, they fought nobody, I'm going to fade them. And sometimes that'll work out, Dan. We've all done it, right? However, there are certain times where you got to ignore the sample size that can hurt you and just judge them for what they're doing. Sure, is the opponent not doing the right things or offering commensurate, feedback in the exchanges? Yes, that makes it difficult. That being said, what is the fighter we're studying? What are they doing? What decisions are they making? And I loved everything I saw from Arman Tsarukyan. I'm very high on this kid. So I'm really looking forward to diving into this matchup further.
Yeah, no, I feel like it's one of those things where for Davi to win this fight, he's got to use his world-class jiu-jitsu. I mean, catch him with, on an entry, grab that neck, something like that. Or, I mean, I know you saw against Nick Hine, that blast double, passes the guard, goes for that Kimura attempt, changes that into a back take, chokes him out. It's like, oh my God, like, how did you do that? You know what I mean? And it's some world-class stuff, man. And for Armand, I feel like he's just got to be solid in this fight. You know what I mean? Don't give up any takedowns. If you're shooting on him, make sure that neck's not exposed. And Davi does throw some bombs on the feet, but if you can kind of out volume him a little bit, maybe get ahead on the scorecards and kind of just wear him down over the 3-round course, pin him up against the fence, try to take a little bit of energy out of him, try to get a little bit of sting off those punches and then kind of ride him out a little bit. Who cares if it's a boring fight? Just go out there and win. Because I'm telling you this, Davi Hamish can finish a fight in an instant, standing and on the mat. So you don't want to take too many risks with a guy like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, outside of Hamos, clipping Saryukin with something and him taking a bad shot, even that's hard to see because of the single leg and high crotch style Saryukin gets. He almost encourages guys to either um, snap them down, or give their back in defense in the first step or the second step. Daniel Cormier does it a lot with his snap down singles too. He encourages that back take. So if Ramos tries to jump on in these situations that I'm trying to map out in my head, I still think that Saryukin can stay safe. So kind of like how you mapped it out, Dan. Unless he gets that opportunistic submission, again, I gotta still jump into this fight, folks. But my initial feeling is unless Ramos gets an opportunistic submission, I feel like no matter what they're doing, if they're grappling on the floor, against the cage, or they're kickboxing in the open, Saryukian's going to be doing more of it. Whatever they're going to be doing, he's going to be doing more of it. He's got the better pace. I think that is proven. Um, so unless he gets caught by something, I just see him outworking Ramos to a decision. To be honest.
I could see it, my friend. Well, let's go ahead and wrap this thing up. Firstly, we want to give another shout out to all our listeners, all our supporters, the fans. Thank you all so much for everything. Make sure you comment below. Let us know what you think, your picks, your predictions, your comments, criticisms, whatever the case may be. You want to tell Dan Tom how good looking he is, go ahead and do it. But guys, thank you so much. Make sure you go to linemovement.com. Hit us up on Twitter at line_movement. Big shout out to our producer, Jordan, to everyone behind the scenes, Joe, Dan, James, our amazing editors. You guys are the real MVPs. Thank you so, so much. Make sure you follow me at Best Fight Picks. Follow Dan at Dan Tom MMA. You can catch me at bestfightpicks.com or at Half the Battle later on. My boy Dan Tom is available at the Protect Your Neck podcast. Thank you all very much. Everybody stay safe and enjoy the fights.